Of course, a 10-week course that I'm trying to compress into about 45 or 50 minutes. And if I'm not controlled, I'm easily capable of going on for 3 or 4 hours. So there are people in the back who are going to wave me down after 45 minutes or so. But I'm going to try and move through this fairly quickly. And I apologize in advance for the fact that the musical examples I'm going to give, I'm going to have to cut them off midway through. It tears my heart out to do this, especially when little Walter is playing harmonica. But in the interest of getting through this in the regulated time, I'm going to do that. Anyway, what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today is several main themes that will structure the talk. First of all, defining what it is that we actually mean by the blues, and there's a good deal of confusion about this among people who deal with the music or who are in the general public. And then secondly, what is Chicago blues? That is, what's specific about this particular genre of blues. Also to ask the question how the blues came to Chicago, and this has a lot to do with the history of the city in general and what's the so-called Great Migration of African Americans up from the Deep South to the north. And then finally, how the blues changed in Chicago. And this is a kind of dialectical process of change both of the city and the music at the same time, and they're both very intimately involved. So anyway, these are the kinds of things I'm going to try and cover. And I'll start with this attempt to define what the blues are. And again, as with most of the statements I'm making, this is a very complicated issue, and I'm giving you a very kind of condensed Sesame Street version of this. Every statement really should be nuanced by at least a half an hour's discussion, and we can perhaps talk about that in the questions. The famous French poet, André Breton, surrealist poet, defined blues once as a fusion of music and poetry accomplished at a very high emotional temperature. And I think that's a pretty good poetic description of what the blues are. But as ethnomusicologists, generally we like to sort of define things in a little bit more mundane way. And so I'm going to talk to you about the kinds of characteristics of the music that actually define the blues as a distinct genre. Now, this is unlike jazz, for example, which started off as a music with a very distinct content as well as a style. And over time, jazz has evolved into a kind of style of playing almost any music. So you can play Christmas carols or Beethoven as jazz. Blues has retained its distinct form and content as well as the style of the music. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Basically, there's a distinctive sound, structure, a set of rhythms, improvisation is important, and then a kind of poetic voice and themes. And all of those things together define what constitutes the blues. Now, first is the sound. And the blues as a kind of music have a distinctive scale that's different than the standard European scale. And they also have this thing called blue notes, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. The difference between the standard European scale and the blues scale is that, first of all, the blues scale has one less note than the European scale. And it also has certain intervals that are flattened. So if you take, for example, the C scale, as you can see here, it's missing, the blues scale is actually missing 2 notes. So it misses the D and the A, and it has these notes which are flattened. Now this means that those notes are the ones that are called blue notes, and the reason they're called blue notes is that they're just slightly flatter than the actual flat would be in the European scale. It's a sound that's a little odd to a European classical ear. Just to give you a sense of what that sounds like, this is the C scale played musically. And this is the blues scale in C. You can see that sounds very, very different. It has a completely different feel to the music. There's also a distinctive structure. And this is, I should say also that in order to play those sounds, those blue notes and that scale, African American musicians who invented this music in the Deep South actually had to transform the instruments they were playing so that they could produce these sounds that were done on instruments that were not meant to get these sounds, like the guitar and the harmonica. The guitar, as you know, has frets on it, and when you press down, it gives you standard European notes. So what these musicians did was to bend the strings, that is, you don't just push down, but actually bend them up to change the vibrations on the guitar. Or they play it with a bottle or a knife or something that they move along the strings to alter the vibration pattern. And that allows you to get these blue notes. And on the harmonica, what they had to do, which is made, these were things made to play Bavarian folk music, which doesn't have these sounds in it. What they had to do was change the pressure in the mouth to actually bend the reeds in the harmonica to give you these bent notes. And this allows you to get these notes on an instrument that was not at all made for that. I'll give you just a very brief demonstration of what that sounds like. So those are the sort of standard notes that it's meant to play. But to bend the note, you go like this. And by doing that, you can reach any note you want on the instrument. But somebody had to invent that. It didn't just come naturally. Anyway, in addition to this distinctive sound, the blues also has a structure. And the most common form that we find is what's called the 12-bar blues. Now, there are also other variations. There are 6-bar blues, 16-bar blues, 8-bar blues. There are a variety of other variations. But probably 75 to 80% of the music you hear in blues is this 12-bar structure. Now, it wasn't always that way. And when the original country blues were played, when it was first invented, there was a wide range of variation. But as musicians began to play together in groups, they needed something with more structure, and the 12-bar blues emerged as the most common structure for all of this music. Now, this involves a standard lyric pattern as well, so that it's what is called an AAB lyric pattern. That means the first line is repeated twice, and then there's a third line. So it would be something like, woke up this morning, looked around for my shoes. I woke up this morning, looked around for my shoes. That's when I knew I had those mean old walking blues. So it's always 2 times repeating the first line and then a third line which resolves. And those 3 lines are spread over the 12 bars with 4 bars each. And that has also a distinctive chord progression, which involves 3 different chords. There's the first note, the root chord, then one that is 4 above and 5 above. So these are also called the tonic, subdominant, and dominant, but we won't worry about that for the moment. But the way in which the 12-bar blues works is that the first 4 bars, that is the first A of the AAB pattern, is all in the root chord. So if you were doing a C, it would all be in the C. Then for 2 bars in the second line, it moves up to the 4th, and then back down to the 1st for 2 bars. And then in the third line, it moves up to the 5th, then down to the 4th, and then to the 1st for 2 lines. Or if you're going to repeat the song, that is, continue the song, instead of the last one being a 1, it moves back up to the 5th to do what's called the turnaround. And you'll hear this later when we play some of the music, but this is the classic sort of pattern that characterizes 12-bar blues. Not only that, but there's also an interplay of the voice and the instruments. So it isn't as if the voice just accompanies the instruments along. They actually work off of each other. So they sort of wind in and out, and it's sort of like a call and response pattern between the voice and the instruments. Now, there are also a set of characteristic rhythms that define the blues. There are a number of these, and I'm going to talk only about a few of the most common ones. What's really crucial here is to understand that all of this music has an emphasis on what's called the backbeat. So in a standard European song, the musical emphasis is on the first and the third notes of a 4-note bar. In the blues, it's on the second and the 4th note, which is called the backbeat. And this is what makes the blues swing. It's completely different than European music. And it's really characteristic of all of these blues sounds. And it was then carried over into other things like rock and a variety of other kinds of music. And it's very funny because I know my good friend, the harmonicist Billy Blues, said he often laughs because when he's playing in the blues clubs and he starts telling people to clap, you can see that all of the African Americans are clapping on the second and 4th beat, and a lot of the white people are clapping on the 1st and the 3rd beat because they're so used to. These are the kinds of things that get ingrained in your sense of rhythm. Anyway, there are several of these backbeat sounds, and the most common of all is what's called a shuffle. And that's simply, it's also a beat in which the weight is not constant throughout the measure. So the first note and the third note take a little bit longer. They're sort of held on a little bit longer, and then you come in with that backbeat. So it's sort of like, if you were to hear it, it would be like, I can't do it very well with that, maybe. And the shuffle is just that done at a sort of constant rhythm, and I'll show you what it sounds like in a piece of music. So you get a sound of what the shuffle is like, and a huge amount of Chicago blues is played with a shuffle rhythm. Now there's also something called slow blues, and that's basically a shuffle rhythm slowed way down. So it's basically the same thing, but you really slow it down. And this requires, to make it really swing, it requires a very good rhythm section. I'll show you what that sounds like. So, and again, I'm terribly sorry to have to cut these things off, but that's a great example of a really good slow blues. Another beat that's much faster, kind of up-tempo dance beat. All of this music was basically made to dance to, but the really sort of quick-stepping dance beat is called often a mojo beat or sometimes a cut shuffle. It's a very sort of fast-paced, almost two-step-like thing, and this is what it sounds like. Anyway, that was the Great Muddy Waters, and you can see why this beat is called the Mojo Beat. That's after his song, Got My Mojo Working. Now another fast-paced beat that is often used is something called a boogie beat. And this actually comes from a style of piano playing called boogie-woogie or slide piano. And it's one in which there is a kind of left-hand pattern of what's called a walking bass, but done with a very fast tempo. And I'll show you first a little bit of boogie-woogie piano, and then show you how that is translated into Chicago blues boogie style. Okay, so now this is what it sounds like translated into Chicago instrumental style. So that's the boogie-woogie style in Chicago, and that was, of course, Hound Dog Taylor, who's a great slide guitar player. Now, another aspect of this music is the need for improvisation. This is an expected part of the music, and that goes in terms of both the lyrics and the music itself. So a lot of performance in the blues consists of improvising on songs that are a kind of common core of the music. They're old standards that everyone plays. And people are expected to sort of improvise around those, to create new improvisations from older music. Some other people who are sort of rock critics and people like that sometimes misunderstand the music and talk about them doing covers, which is sort of a bad thing in rock because it means you're imitating. But in fact, like classical music, blues is based upon performance, not so much writing new music, but what you can do with your instrument playing old standard repertoire. And so improvisation is really important. And you'll often see musicians get together who've never played before up on a stage, and they all sort of understand what the other ones are going to do. And they'll just, the person who's leading the band will just sort of point to somebody and expect them to start improvising. In this sense, it's very much like jazz, although the nature of the improvisation is quite different than jazz improvisation. There's also a very characteristic kind of poetic voice and some themes that are involved. And this poetic voice involves the singing in the first person. So the music is never about general issues. It's not like times are hard, The economy's bad, love is horrible. It's, I lost my job, my baby left me. It's all sung from the first person. So it's a first-person experience, which gives a general sentiment, but it's always through the person singing. And this is an attempt really to kind of assert, on the one hand, to sing about general problems through the person, but also to assert personhood in circumstances where this was really a very difficult thing to do originally. The whole system in which this music developed was one which was designed to deny African Americans the possibility of having this personhood. So it was in many ways quite a radical statement. Anyway, we'll get to more about that later, but it also tends to involve themes of trouble, hardship, loss, bravado, all these sorts of things, in love, job, disasters, various kinds of issues. And there's also very commonly a kind of ironic humor that's involved in the music, and lots of double meanings, double entendre. That is, a person is singing about one thing, but it actually means something quite different. Often it's sort of sexual allusions, but it can be a variety of different things there's always a sort of second meaning in what's being sung. Anyway, we can talk more about that later, but I also wanted to, in addition to the sort of general characteristics of this field of music or genre of music that we call the blues, there are different regional styles as well that developed. And originally, when this music first developed near the end of the 19th century, there were three main groups. There was the so-called Piedmont blues, which developed along the East Coast in places like Georgia and Florida. There was the Delta blues, which evolved in the Delta area of the Mississippi River, not the Mississippi Delta, but the Delta above that actual Mississippi Delta in Mississippi and parts of Arkansas and Louisiana. And then Texas blues, which developed in the lumber camps and oil fields of Texas, and then moved off in different directions. Now these three local original places for the blues, which had their own distinctive styles, then moved north as part of the Great Migration. And they moved in three different streams. And that's why the Delta blues is very important in the development of Chicago blues, because most of the African Americans who went to Chicago came from the area where the Delta blues originated in Mississippi and those surrounding areas. Whereas the ones from Texas tended to go off to Southern California. And the ones from the Piedmont area went up to New York and the cities along the East Coast. Now, the Delta blues and the Texas blues each developed their subsequent styles into urban blues forms. The Piedmont blues did not. So it really didn't have any follow-up in New York or places like that. But the other two were very influential. And they were influential not only in developing urban blues styles, for example, the Delta in Chicago, but also modern varieties of popular music in general. So the Chicago blues and the various derivatives of Texas blues had a huge influence in producing rock and roll, the British blues, and so-called blues rock. All of these things are really growing right out of that tradition in ways that we'll talk about later. Now, I mentioned that this was part of the Great Migration. This is a process of migration that started in the first decade, really right around the first decade of the 20th century, or right around the First World War, and lasted up through say the 1960s or so. And during this period, over 6 million African Americans moved out of the South up into the North. And this was the greatest internal migration in the history of the United States. It was a huge mass movement of people. But as I mentioned, it tended to be in these three waves. So this is the region that gave birth here to the the Delta blues, and then to the Chicago blues. And you can see why it ended up here in Chicago. And the Texas blues people tended to move off into this area. And then Piedmont blues people moved up here, but there was no sort of follow-up to that in the New York area. And this, again, is to remind you that it's not the Mississippi Delta that people talk about when they talk about Delta blues. The Mississippi Delta is actually down here near New Orleans. It is the delta of the Mississippi River up here in Mississippi, centered around Yazoo County. And it's this flat, black soil area that was used for growing cotton. And again, we'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, just to give you a sense of the importance of the Delta blues to Chicago blues, in large measure, the Chicago blues is Delta blues played on electronic instruments and transformed in certain ways that make it distinctive, but nevertheless heavily rooted in the Delta sound. And it was actually the Delta musicians who moved up from Mississippi to Chicago that played this music. But in the process of electrifying the instruments, they didn't just make it louder, they actually transformed the sound into something which was a kind of tough, aggressive music with this thundering backbeat. And it's people like Muddy Waters and Howlin Wolf who changed this music into something that was really distinctive. Just to give you a sense, I'll play one song in both versions. It's a song by Robert Johnson, who was one of these early Delta bluesmen. He is credited with having written this song and was recorded in 1936 in a hotel room in the South. And then I'll give you the same song played about 30 years later in Chicago. So this is the Robert Johnson version here. So there you see, that's a pretty good example of both the connection to the Delta and the way in which the music was transformed in Chicago. Again, it's not just making it louder, but emphasizing certain aspects of it, like that really thumping backbeat that really drive the music and make it much more kind of aggressive. Anyway, there is a history to the development of this sound, and many people think that the blues actually goes way, way back in time. I mean, you hear people say it's sort of eternal, it goes back to the origins of music, or that it comes from slavery. But in fact, most musical scholars think that it actually originated around the 1890s. So it's a post-slavery phenomenon. And there was one thing I wanted to emphasize a little earlier in talking about the nature of the music. This is actually a brilliant original creation by African Americans in, as we'll see, some really dire circumstances, of a music that doesn't actually sound like anything else. There are elements of African traditions in it, elements of European music, but they were combined and created in a way that made it something completely original. There's nothing, for example, in all of Africa that sounds like the blues. There are certain kinds of tonalities, certain responses that are blues-like, but nothing that sounds like the blues. There's nothing in Europe that sounds like the blues either. It's a highly original creation, a fusion of various kinds of elements that produce something extraordinarily original, and that is a really powerful music. So powerful that it has influenced almost every other genre of popular music since it was created. Anyway, it was first born in the Delta in Mississippi, in the area that I showed you. We know that it was created in this time because there are early accounts of people like Ma Rainey and Jelly Roll Morton and what's his name, W.C. Handy, who styled himself as the father of the blues, where they first talk about hearing this music in 1902 and 1903. Before that, this was not a widespread music, and they were startled by it. These were African-American musicians in the South, but from urban contexts, who had not heard this kind of music before. W.C. Handy, for example, described hearing it in a train stop in Tutwiler, Mississippi, and called it the strangest thing he'd ever heard. So they were completely unfamiliar with this music at that time, which means that it was probably not much earlier than that the music had actually developed in that form. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I just wanted to give you first a sense of the general chronology. There was, by the 1930s, the first recordings of blues, and in fact, the first publication of a blues song was in 1908. But the first recordings were actually made in the 1920s. Unfortunately, we don't have recordings from the period of its origins in the 1890s. Then the music moved up to Chicago with the Great Migration, and we had several different styles that evolved in Chicago. Now, the first of these in the 1930s what is often called the Bluebird sound, because it was done on Bluebird Records, which was a label, a subsidiary label at that time. And they created a very distinctive style of blues, which was much softer, as we'll see, than the Delta blues typically was. Then, pardon me, that in the 1940s and 50s, we had the emergence of what is now considered to be the sort of classic Chicago sound. And that's with people like Muddy Waters, Howlin Wolf, Little Walter, Elmore James, and the others. And again, I'll show you examples of that later. In the late 1950s and 60s, there was the development of what is often called the West Side sound. And this was a much more guitar-driven sound with single-string guitar playing, a technique that was made popular by B.B. King, but which was taken up by these great guitar gods in Chicago, people like Otis Rush, Magic Sam, and Buddy Guy, and changed into something completely different. Now, that was rooted in the previous sound, and all of these people had played with Muddy Waters and others before, but they evolved the music into something else. And again, I'll give you some examples later. In the 1960s, we also see a shift for the first time in the audience for blues music. For the first time, white people in this country began to become aware of blues music, and there developed a white audience for this music, which was fortunate for the musicians because it happened to coincide to a time when the young African Americans were turning away from the blues and more towards other forms of musical expression like soul and funk that they found much more aggressive, much more, how should I say, politically engaged in terms of representing the Black Power movement of that period in the post-civil rights era. Again, we'll talk about the reasons for that a little bit later. But you get a shifting audience, and for the first time, actually, as well as a white audience, you also begin to get some white musicians who are starting to play the blues. And there are basically a couple of groups of those, one in Chicago and the other in England, for odd reasons. And they both had an influence in popularizing the blues and making white audiences actually understand that they had this enormous musical treasure in their country all along that they never knew about. Okay. And from the 1980s to the present, you have the rise of the first generation of musicians who were no longer migrating up from Mississippi and playing the music in the urban context, but who were actually born in the North. They were born in places like Chicago and grew up hearing the music there. So they were not part of the up from Mississippi generation. Anyway, to then situate that a little bit in the history of the places from which this music began, we have to talk a little bit about the Delta, the so-called Delta in the South. Now, in 1807, the Atlantic slave trade was outlawed, which theoretically at least meant that no more slaves could actually be brought into this country from Africa. Now, in fact, that persisted for a little bit longer, but effectively from that point on, it meant that the African American communities that were in this country were reproducing among themselves, and their connections to Africa were farther and farther away. Now, the Yazoo Delta, the area where this music began, was originally a forested area that was the home of Choctaw Indians. But from the 1820s and 30s, this area began to be deforested and planted with large cotton plantations. And so you had white plantation owners who moved into this area with large groups of African American slaves and started growing cotton on this black soil. Now, slavery officially ended in 1865 with the end of the Civil War. But in fact, it ended really only in its official form. It actually was continued under another form called the sharecropper system, in which white plantation owners were no longer legally allowed to hold slaves as property, but they developed a system of indenture so that they were able to hold people on the land and basically keep them more or less as slaves for that period on. The landowners owned all the land, the plantation owners, and what they would do is farm out portions of this to African American families who would grow crops with seed bought from the plantation owner and then have to turn over profits to the plantation owner in the end. And it usually worked out so that they were sufficiently cheated that they were constantly getting deeper and deeper in debt instead of actually making any money. And they were, by that means, effectively held on as a kind of slave system. Now, with 1877, we had an agreement that's often called the Compromise Act. In fact, it was a kind of secret deal rather than an actual act. But it was in order to settle a disputed election, much like the one we had with Bush-Gore. But in this case, the party of Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republicans, again, the nature of the parties was completely the inverse of what they were today. The Republican Party was the party of the North, the Democrats were the party of the South. In that period, there was a disputed election, and the Republicans agreed that if the Democrats would allow Rutherford B. Hayes to become the president, they would pull the troops out of the South and essentially stop the Reconstruction process. And thereby, they basically abandoned all of the promises they had made to former slaves after the Civil War. From that point on, they were more or less left on their own, and you had the institution of this really brutal reign of terror that was implemented, known as the Jim Crow system. It was a racial segregation. It was a whole system of lynchings, brutality, vagrancy laws, convict lease systems, penal farms, so that any African American who was seen to be out of place could be automatically arrested and put on chain gangs or penal farms, and then they were actually leased out to people to farm these plantations. So again, another kind of form of slavery. And in the period from about 1880 to 1930, that is in a 50-year period just after this system developed, there were something like 3,500 African Americans lynched. Now that's just the ones who were officially counted as murdered. The system of beatings, brutality, and other kinds of things was much, much more vast than that. So this was a really horrendous system, a system of American apartheid with terrorism attached to it. It was also the period that marked the rise of the Ku Klux Klan as a kind of enforcement wing of this program, and also things like voter prevention. So various systematic ways found to prevent African Americans from voting in local elections and having any kind of political voice as well. Now, in the 1890s, this segregation system was actually sanctioned by a decision of the American Supreme Court in one of the most scandalous acts of the Supreme Court. In the Plessy versus Ferguson case, you had the official sanctioning by the American government of the separate but equal idea. This was overturned later in Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act, but this took another 100 years before this was done. 10 minutes, oh boy, okay, I'd better move on. Anyway, it's under these circumstances that you get the context of the emergence of this Delta blues sound. Now, as I mentioned, the first blues song was actually published in 1908, and the first recordings were in the 1920s. And the very first recordings of blues songs are actually by female singers, people like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith. And these were actually done with jazz bands rather than country blues musicians. These were former vaudeville singers who picked up this music and sang it with jazz bands. I was going to give you an example, but we're short on time, so I won't. And then you had Delta bluesmen, such as Charlie Patton, Son House, Robert Johnson, and others, who were recorded by traveling ethnomusicologists in the South, or recording studios who would tape this music and then sell it. Now, the first great wave of the migration began around 1914, and it was caused by a variety of factors, including decimation of the cotton crops with boll weevil, the wartime factories having a huge demand for labor at the beginning of the First World War, with a lot of men sent into the military and the stopping of immigration. And the northern factories were actually giving African Americans train fare to come up to Chicago to work, something that wasn't much appreciated by the plantation owners in the South and was greatly resisted. And there was also the idea of attempting to escape from this horrendous system that had been built up at this time. So you had, at this period, the formation of Bronzeville in South Chicago, and a sort of movement of people up for economic opportunity in the South, and the first formation of this early Chicago blues sound called the Bluebird Records. Now this is just to show you the sort of main routes that went up. It was the Illinois Central Railroad and the famous Blues Highway, Route 61, which brought people from Mississippi up to Chicago. And it was a transformation of a rural population who had been extremely deprived of all sorts of rights into Chicago, a dense urban context. And there were various kinds of freedom that were offered to people in the North. It was not the promised land that had been imagined. They did gain a vast increase in wages by working in these factories. They had relative freedom in the sense that they could walk down streets and not be subject to beatings and all sorts of other indignations just by walking on the same sidewalk with white people. And also, the politicians in Chicago were falling all over themselves to get African Americans to vote for them. So they weren't prevented from voting, they actually encouraged through the patronage system to vote for candidates in the North. So there are certain elements of their new life that was a great improvement from what they had before. But it doesn't mean to say that they didn't meet discrimination in the North. In fact, just the opposite. They settled in areas where they were permitted to settle, and that was not all over Chicago, but primarily originally in an area called the Black Belt on the south side surrounding the University of Chicago. And what you see here is a map of the gradual expansion of this Black Belt, and all of those little dots that you see here represent houses that were bombed during this process of expansion in the 1920s and 30s. So it was not greeted by the white people who were living there with a sort of open arms. There were certain segregation restrictions that were still placed on people. It wasn't quite the same experience in the South, but they did not meet the promised land. Anyway, Bronzeville was this area that developed into a kind of second city within the city, which had all of the range of African American social classes, from doctors to university professors to working men to a whole range of things, but they were all compressed together. And all of the institutions of downtown were essentially reproduced in Bronzeville. And 47th Street became like the Broadway of the South Side. But there was very high density living caused by this sort of concentration of people. The population increase was just at a massive rate. And here you see the old Regal Theater as part of this 47th Street. And places like the Palm Tavern, which used to be a very famous kind of watering hole for people on 47th Street. Now this early bluebird sound, as I told you, was a much kind of lighter form of the blues than we hear with the Delta blues. The singing was much less impassioned. The lyrics were much more comical. And this is the famous Tampa Red as part of that movement. He was actually born in Georgia, and I'm not actually sure why they call him Tampa Red, except he must have passed through Tampa at some point. But I'll just give you a very quick hint of what that's like.
You know, bootlegs there used to live across town. The law went there and it closed us down. Now you can't get the stuff no more. Now you can't get that stuff no more. No matter how you try, you can't get that stuff no more. So
that's the bluebird sound. Now in the 1940s and 50s, you had a second massive movement of this wave of immigration, again caused by the factories needing people to work in the North, and also by the introduction of mechanical cotton pickers in the South, which enabled these plantation owners to essentially do away with African American labor. And this is the period where you had factories running 24 hours in Chicago, people with lots of money in their pockets, and they would go into these blues clubs which were running night and day, and there were dozens and dozens of them all over the South Side. Okay, I'm 5 minutes, I'm getting there. And this is where you have the development with people like Muddy Waters and Howlin Wolf of this incredibly powerful music that generated all sorts of other things. I'm going to give you just a very brief clip here of Howlin Wolf. I'm sure you all know what he sounds like, but... Anyway, that gives you a sense of there was actually several different styles within this classic Chicago genre, including people like Little Walter, who was a genius on the harmonica. He made the harmonica do things that nobody had imagined before. And I'm not going to be able to play you a clip of this. We can perhaps do it in the questions if you like, but I need to get rapidly through this. Also, Sonny Boy Williamson II, whose real name was Rice Miller, who had his own distinctive style of harmonica playing. That was, he was the main competitor to Little Walter at that time, along with Big Walter Horton. And Elmore James, of course, who had this tradition of slashing slide guitar style playing that went down through people like J.B. Hutto to Hound Dog Taylor and others. Little Ed is the sort of current embodiment of that in Chicago. And of course, Jimmy Reed, who had a much more kind of country version of the music and was one of the most popular sellers of the time. Now, these people played in a variety of different venues, including house rent parties, Maxwell Street, blues clubs, and then for the lucky ones, recordings in places like Chess Record Studios. House rent parties were just things that people improvised when they needed money at the end of the month to pay the rent. They would cook up some food, get in some liquor, and a few musicians. People would come and pay a little bit of money, and they'd have a big party, and then they'd be able to pay the rent. Maxwell Street was, as I'm sure you know, this open-air market that used to exist, and musicians used to come down and play on the street for money in the midst of all this kind of swirling activity. Now, Maxwell Street still existed up until a few years ago, when it was finally kind of demolished by the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I was going to play you a clip from this. Maybe I can do that again later too. But it was a very, very lively scene in a place where a lot of Chicago bluesmen really honed their chops before they got invited into blues clubs and eventually to records. This is what it looked like a few years ago. It was still here, and this is what it looks like today. They've put a few statues up of blues musicians on the street to sort of commemorate what used to be there, but it doesn't exist. And this is to show you that in the 1950s, there were dozens and dozens of these blues clubs concentrated in the African-American neighborhoods on the west side and the south side. In the 60s, you had the development, as I mentioned, of this so-called West Side sound, which was the people like Buddy Guy and Otis Rush, who developed this new single-string playing guitar style, where the guitar was really the dominant element of this. And this influenced, again, all of the sort of rock guitar gods. People like Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, all of these people, they would be unthinkable if it hadn't been for these guys who developed this stuff. And I mentioned this is also the period where you have the shift in the audience and also the scene of blues clubs in Chicago. So it's the opening first of blues clubs on the north side, which became much better paying clubs and eventually attracted all the better musicians to go up and play in those clubs. And gradually, they have sort of disappeared from the south side and the west side. There are still a few there, but they're not very important. Again, here's just a very brief clip of Otis Rush. So Otis Rush was one of this trio of great guitar gods. Buddy Guy, of course, who's still playing, and Magic Sam, who died very early, tragically. You also had Junior Wells, who played with Buddy Guy on the harmonica for a long time, and instructing here one of the current big harmonica gods of Chicago, Billy Branch. And then in the 60s also is the period where you had the first emergence, as I mentioned, of white musicians who were playing this music. First, there were several in Chicago itself who went down to the south side and trained at the feet of these Chicago bluesmen like Muddy Waters and the Wolf and people like that. And they learned through a system of apprenticeship how to play this music in its authentic fashion there. And so people like Paul Butterfield, Mike Bloomfield, got their training in this way. And the sound that they played was classic Chicago blues sound styles music. And they began to play as integrated bands, which is a very common practice now in Chicago. This is another one. Charlie Musselwhite is another one of these people. Many of them actually came to university in Chicago and then heard the music on the south side and then became musicians. You also had, on the other side of the water, a bunch of young British musicians who heard this on records in England, and they all fell in love with the music. It was so powerful that they wanted to be Chicago blues bands. But of course, they had never actually seen it played in this way. They didn't learn it through an apprenticeship, but by listening to records. And so all of these bands, who I'm sure are familiar to most of you, started off wanting to be Chicago blues bands. Their first records are all blues-based, and they really wanted to be like Chicago blues bands. But of course, they developed sounds which didn't really sound like Chicago blues, and eventually moved off in other directions. Now, the current generation involves people like Billy Branch and Lurie Bell, who's the son of a great harmonica player, Kerry Bell. And they have they're again growing directly out of this long-standing Chicago tradition, but taking the blues in new directions. Again, we're not going to have time to play too many of them, but John Primer is another one of these. If you ever have a chance to see John Primer play, by all means do it. He's an incredible musician. Anyway, I'm afraid I'm being sort of chopped off at the neck here, so I will stop it at this point. Thank you.